It's good to see everyone here this morning. Last week, we started a new class. As I mentioned, it is summertime, so we do something a little bit different in the summer, that we have different teachers just kind of teaching short periods of time. So you're going to have me up here for a couple weeks. Clark will be teaching, Jay will be teaching, and then also Clay has volunteered to do some teaching for us too. So we're looking forward to the variety that we're going to have. So if you get tired of me, don't worry. You have someone else coming behind me. So this morning, what we're going to do is continue something that we started last week. One of the things I shared with you is about, every 5 years or so, I have a class where we talk with the teens. Sometimes we hit on dating because they're all interested about that too. Talking about it, also talking about sexual purity, right? If you're in high school, you're getting hit with all sorts of things, right? You're hearing things from your friends. Just if you're in our culture, you're hearing things too. What you're watching on TV, what's in our music, and it's nothing new, right? I mean, if you remember someone playing some music, Frank Sinatra, and you could hear the undertones there too, right? So it's always been in our culture, this idea of, sexual purity, sexual desires, and those type of things. So I think it's good for me, I reach out to the parents. I say, here's something I'm going to be talking about. I let them know about it. I used you last week, Leslie. I sent you a text, and you were like, go for it. Have that talk with them about what's right and what's not. So we recently did that in the teen class. So sometimes when I teach, what I like to do is, share, here's some of the things that we were talking about. But this just isn't a teen thing, right? It just isn't a culture thing. These are things that we need to think of as adults. Think about choices that we're making, things that we're watching, things we're listening to, and then, some of these things are church issues too. You can think of churches where there's been something that's broken the church up because of something that happened within the church. I happened to be teaching this, it was maybe 6 months ago, and I think it was the night I was going to come in and we were going to study something, and I looked on my phone on Facebook, and there was a church in Green who a man on Wednesday night had, they didn't give the details, but he was teaching a class in the church, and he had done something with one of the girls, and he had been arrested. So this is a reminder of how important it is that we talk about these things, keep them in our minds. It was heartbreaking to see and to know about, but it's a very important topic. The book that we're reading, this individual has been a counselor for part of his life. The first chapter that we talked about last week, Forfeiting What Could Have Been, is where he shared some of the stories of things that he's had to deal with as a Christian counselor. Things he hoped, wouldn't happen in the church, but happened. I'm not going to go through some of those I shared, but the point that he wanted to get across was that in life we take paths, right? And sometimes we never know where that other path would have led. Sometimes it's simple things like making a decision to move somewhere. Many years ago, I made a decision to move to Charlottesville, Virginia, right? Changed my life, right, to be here. I don't know what would have happened if I had gone somewhere else. I went to UVA to school. I could have gone to Ohio State. It would have been up in Columbus. It would have been a different life, right? Different people. I wouldn't have known all of you. I'm glad I got to know all of you and to be here. But we have paths that we take throughout life that are important, and they just are major decisions that we make. He wanted to point out in this chapter about all the things that these people that made these poor decisions in their life, what they forfeited. They had broken families that they left behind, things that affected them in the decisions they made. They never knew, what could have been, right? And you wished you could tell them what their life would have been like. So we talked a little bit about that. Chapter 2, we just touched on. Talked about enlightened self-interest. One of the things that he said that he felt was almost everyone that was in these situations when they were making those poor decisions thought they were actually making a decision that was best for them. It was in their self-interest to do this. His point that he was getting across was really if you understood what was best for you, you would actually probably be doing the opposite of the decision that you made. If you're really thinking about what the future was going to pan out like, or if you could fast forward, you would realize all the heartache some of these decisions are going to cause. So really, when you think about what's best for you, sometimes you really don't have the right thing in mind. And he goes on to talk about, the best thing for us is understanding how God would have us behave, what decisions God would have us to do, and how he would want us to live our lives. We kind of ended with this quote last week. Satan's greatest victories and our biggest defeats come when he gets us to ask, should I choose what God commands me, or should I do what's best for me? Right? And I think this goes along, this is something I think Tim even hit on a few weeks ago about that idea of people thinking that there's what God commands us to do, and if we're doing that, then we're missing out on good stuff, right? But that's not the case. Really, if we're doing what God asks us to do, we're getting to experience the good stuff in life, right? These are not two separate things. What's best for me is what God asks me to do. But the world tries to get us to think in a way that we separate these two things, right? As many of us know, we have Vacation Bible School coming up, right? So I'm going to have to probably brush up on some songs. I picked this verse out. If you know the song that this comes from, if you know me too, I'm not the greatest singer, and when I have to sing and actually do things with my hands together with that, that's a real challenge. Especially if I'm trying to keep beat, I have challenges with that too. So I wanted to read this. This is a verse that he brings out in the chapter talking about self-interest. Matthew 7:24 through 27. Does anybody want to read that for me? Or I can read it? How many readers? Okay, I will read this. Therefore, everyone who hears these words of mine and puts them into practice is like a wise man who builds his house on the rock. So this is Jesus telling the story. The rain came down, and the streams rose, and the winds blew and beat against that house, yet it did not fall, because it had its foundations on the rock. But everyone who hears these words of mine and does not put them into practice is like a foolish man who builds his house on sand. The rain came, the streams rose, and the winds blew and beat against that house, and it fell with a great crash. So we know that song that we sing during Vacation Bible School, but the point that's being brought up here is if you're following God's word, if you're following God's ways, what's the word that's used to describe you? What's it used? Say it out loud. Wise? Say wise. If you're not following it, what's the word that's used to describe you? Foolish. So you got the foolish and the wise man, right? So this is kind of where he brings in his principle. So the book's called The Purity Principle. This is what he says throughout the book. He says, purity is always smart. He says impurity is always stupid. That's the way he says it. He says, let me tell you from my experience of all these situations that I've been in and trying to help people, it's always smart. And I think you can probably apply this to sin, right? You can apply it across the board. It's always smart to do what's right, to do what God commands. If you're not doing it, it's stupid. It's foolish. And that's what that story gets to, is it's talking about being wise, being foolish. He also uses the scripture from Deuteronomy chapter 30. This is Moses talking here, talking to the Israelites, right? So Moses has traveled with the Israelites for 40 years, right, in the desert. He knows what they're like. He knows that they're going to follow God at times, but he knows that they're going to fall, right, that they're going to stumble. But he's just trying to encourage them. Before they go, they're on the precipice of the promised land. They've been traveling in the desert, and here they go into the promised land. And you can almost hear him begging in a way, here's what I want you to do. You're getting ready. You're going to cross over. Please do this. And I'll read Deuteronomy 30, 19 through 20. This day I call the heavens and the earth as witnesses against you. I've set before you life and death, blessing and curses. Now choose life, so that you and your children may live, and that you may love the Lord your God. Listen to his voice and hold fast to him. For the Lord is your life, and he will give you many years in the land he swore to give to your fathers, Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. So once again, just trying to get us to line our thinking in the right way, right? Where do we find life? We find life in following God. Right? And I think making sure that whether we're young and we're a teenager or we're older, sometimes we need that compass reoriented just to make sure that we're always thinking about that. Are we making the choices towards a good life? And then finally, I tried to work this in last week when we were in Proverbs, but we just got done reading it. But Proverbs 14, the fear of the Lord is a fountain of life, turning a person from the snares of death. So there's lots of Proverbs that talk about fearing the Lord, which was another topic of a sermon not too long ago, fearing the Lord. So the next chapter, I didn't quite put the whole title of the chapter up there, but the title of the chapter is What is the Big Deal About Sex? So it talks a lot about, the issues with what society has done and what humanity tries to do with sex. I actually had one set of students one time. I don't know if they were trying to shock me or not. Before we started class, they said, sex is actually a good thing. And I was like, okay, well, what do you mean by that? They said, God created us, and he created that, so it's a good thing, but we're only supposed to do that when we're married. I was like, well, it sounds like somebody's either had a talk with him or they've listened during a sermon, right? So I was like, very good. I'm glad to hear that. But we know that, you think about society, all the problems in society that are caused by sex, right? List some of them. Tell me what are some of the issues what are some of the things that happen in our culture that are caused by misuse of this? Right. Yeah, my father's been a teacher, so he's experienced throughout life the effects you see the kids from things like this. So yeah, kids, effects on families that are broken up because of adultery. That's just one example. What other types of things? Abortion, yeah. So a lot of that's happening usually, I don't know what the statistics are, but I bet the statistics are very low that abortions are happening inside of marriage. It's usually these things are occurring outside of marriage, right? So, yes, abortion's been in the news a lot lately. What else? Sexual identity, this is, Yep, we talked a little bit about that last week. That's something that my generation didn't deal with, but my kids have, going on. What else? Disease, yeah, absolutely. Pornography, yes. Yeah, like I mentioned, and I think I've talked about before, my daughter's in the Fellowship of Christian Athletes. It's a group there at the school, and they had, I was glad I went. They had something for Christmas just to get together, and they had a person come in and talk, and he was actually the guy that works with the UVA sports teams. So he talked about his experiences talking to college students about Christ and about God and the things that he's worked with them through. He talked a little bit about I think there was a shooting a few years ago where some of the football players were killed. He talked about his experience with that and talking to those students. And then he also talked about, he brought up pornography too. He said this is a big problem. He says when I was a kid, you had to know the right person to get this stuff. Now you can get it on your phone. He says you guys have something different, right, that you have to deal with and these decisions that you have to make. So pornography, right? Anything else? Sex trafficking is one I think of mine. That's been in the news a lot lately too, right? Think about all the problems that causes and heartache and hurt and damaged lives. So you can think of the list of all the things that misuse of sex in society, what it creates and what it causes. So I wanted to hit on a few things under kind of this idea. So if you're a Christian, this is one of the things we want to get across. If you're a Christian, who owns your body? God. Yeah, Christ, right? He tells a story sometimes when he tries to make this point. He'll be talking somewhere and he'll ask someone, I need a pencil. Can I borrow a pencil? He'll take the pencil and then he'll, in front of everyone, he'll snap it and he'll throw it on the ground and he'll stomp on it. What do you think is the audience's reaction to him taking someone's pencil and stomping on it and breaking it? They shocked, right? They're like, that's not okay. You should not be doing that. But then he says, well, actually, that's my pencil. I brought it in and I gave it to him. And then I asked for it back. So it's actually mine. And then people were like, oh, okay, well, that doesn't seem so bad. It's yours. I understand now. But he's trying to make a point. When something is ours, we get to determine how that thing is treated, how it should be used, right? If our body belongs to God, right? You are not your own. You were bought with a price. Therefore, honor God with your body. God has a say in how it's to be used, right? I think he has a quote in his book. I'll read it. I think he says it very well. When I come to Christ, the title of my life was transferred from me to God. I was bought and paid for. At what price? The shed blood of Christ. We are his by creation. So first we are his by creation, and then again by redemption. He's redeemed us. He has every right to tell me what to do with my mind and my body. Fortunately, God acts not only for his glory, but for my best interests too, right? So he has the right to tell me what I should be trying to pursue, what I should be dwelling on in my mind. Those type of things, those things I should think about, what is noble, what is pure, and what I should be doing with my body, pursuing good works and doing good things. So I think trying to remind, teens and us as well, who is it that we belong to? Who are we to be pursuing, and how are we to be using our time and our lives? I think is a great point to drive home. Another verse that comes up from time to time when we talk about sexuality, sexual immorality, is from 1 Corinthians 6:18, right? So here you get this interesting verse that comes probably with lots of debate, exactly what it means. And we'll talk a little bit about it, and if other people have things they want to add, certainly. But 1 Corinthians 6:18, this is Paul stating, flee from sexual immorality. All other sins a man commits are outside his body, but he who sins sexually sins against his own body. So you have this verse that somehow takes sexual sins, right, and puts it in a different place than other sins. And it's a little bit puzzling when I did it here. I pulled it out of context. We just have one verse. We're actually going to go to that chapter and read a few verses ahead, and I think it'll make more sense. But you wonder, why is it so different? Because other sins do affect the body too. So it doesn't quite make sense. Why is this one so special? So if you would turn to 1 Corinthians 6, and I will read part of that. We're going to start a little bit before 18. I'll find the verse here. And I'll start in verse 15, actually. So 1 Corinthians 6, verse 15. Do you not know that your bodies are members of Christ himself? So this is going back to who do you belong to? Shall I then take the members of Christ and unite them with a prostitute? Never. Do you not know that he who unites himself with a prostitute is one with her in body? For it is said, the two will become one flesh. But whoever is united with the Lord is one with him in spirit. And we get to verse 18. Flee from sexual immorality. All other sins a person commits are outside the body, but whoever sins sexually sins against their own body. Do you not know that your bodies are temples of the Holy Spirit who is in you, whom you have received from God? You are not your own. You are bought with a price. Therefore, honor God with your bodies. So we have this, before we get to this verse, talking about, once again, connecting us with Christ. We are Christ, we are one with him, and then when we connect our bodies to something else, in this case, sexual immorality, it's like we're connecting Christ to that. So it's trying to make how important it is that we're not doing that. Why, in Paul's mind, this is something special that should not be done. So I don't know, any other thoughts on this verse or things you've heard when I went to commentators? This was the one that spoke best to me as far as the explanation to it, but there's lots of, as with most verses, there are different theories on what he was getting at. But I think if we read the context that comes before this one, it makes more sense about what they're getting at here, what Paul is getting at. And the next verse too. Right. Yeah, that the body is a temple of the Holy Spirit. Absolutely. So it just reinforces that point again. This was another quote from the book. It talked about how the most magnificent gifts of God, taken outside of their God-intended boundaries, can become utterly ruinous, right? So it is with sex. Its potential for great good has a flip side and great evil, and we kind of already talked about that. If you heard, I know an analogy that's used all the time is, the analogy with fire, right? If some of you happen to have a fireplace, it's something to enjoy. It keeps you warm. But if it gets outside the fireplace, it can burn the whole house down, right? And that's often the analogy I've heard with sex. In a marriage, that's what it was intended for. But when it leaves those boundaries, then it becomes something that can be dangerous and destructive, right? Same thing I've heard with a campfire. If you use a campfire to stay warm, but it can burn down the whole forest if it's not used properly. So those type of analogies, just kind of sharing those with the teens. I'm sure some of you have heard them too. Finally, with this chapter, we read 1 Thessalonians 4, 3 through 8. It is God's will that you should be sanctified, that you should avoid sexual immorality, that each of you should learn to control your own body in a way that is holy and honorable, not in passionate lust like the pagans who do not know God, and that in this matter no one should wrong or take advantage of a brother or a sister. For God did not call us to be impure, but to live a holy life. Therefore, anyone who rejects this instruction does not reject a human being, but God, the very God who gives you his Holy Spirit. I think it's a good verse to end on in that chapter. We just have 5 more minutes. I will briefly go through. This was the last thing I wanted to touch on was this chapter 4, talking about being targeted and vulnerable. One of the things that starts out talking about is, all of us take precautions in life, things that we're worried about happening to us. One thing we don't do is we don't take all the cash that we own and we don't spread it out on the floor in front of our front door and leave our front door open, right? Nobody does that type of things. You don't leave a pile of cash on the seat of your car so everybody walks by can see it. We kind of have this understanding that we could be burglarized, right? It could happen to us, so we take precautions. We lock our doors. I remember when my kids were young, always telling them, they would leave something, like they just got this, video game thing that cost a couple $100s, and they're leaving it on the seat of the car, and I'm like, you need to cover that up, just so that no one walks by, gets tempted to, test the car door or to smash it. You need to, protect your things. So it makes sense to us. We understand this idea of, potentially being burglarized. We should think about that. Well, understand it's the same thing when it comes to sexual immorality, too. We are all targeted. We're all vulnerable. We can all get in a situation that can create, where we might be tempted. So it's just trying to get that point across to us about, that it can happen, right? We need to be prepared for those things. There's lots of verses that talk about Satan, and this can apply to all sorts of sins, right? But Satan being that roaring lion, 1 Peter 5:8. Be alert and of sober mind. Your enemy, the devil, prowls around like a roaring lion looking for someone to devour. Luke 4:13. When the devil finished all his tempting, he left him until an opportune time. So what is that verse coming from? What's the story, if you recognize it? Christ's temptation, right? So after Christ's baptized, he goes into the desert. He's fasting, and here's a great time, at least for me, if I haven't had food for a while, it would be a great time to come to me and to tempt me, right? At least, they use the term hangry, right? Sometimes you get a little short-tempered. Well, Jesus has been fasting, and he's out there, and he's 40 days, right? So Satan comes to him and tempts him, right? So he's already looking for an opportunity, right? Satan's always looking for an opportunity to get at us. John 8:44, talking about Satan. When Satan lies, he speaks his native language, for he is a liar and the father of lies. And then 1 Corinthians 10, if you think you're standing firm, be careful that you don't fall. And if you go to Proverbs, what's the proverb? It says, pride comes before destruction. It was a haughty spirit before the fall. I think is how it goes. So if you think that you're immune to something, be careful, right? Because maybe that's what Satan's looking for. So just talking to teens and thinking of all of us, that we can get in situations where Satan can try to come at us. This is another example from Genesis chapter 4. Gives us an interesting description of what sin is like, right? So this is the story of Cain and Abel. Does anybody want to paraphrase the story of Cain and Abel? I won't criticize you if you get one of them wrong over the other. I mean, that's always my worry, is I confuse which one was in trouble and which one wasn't. So. Right. So he goes and murders his brother. He calls him out to the field and murders him. So this is where God knows what's up with Cain, and he's counseling him before this happens, right? He says, why are you angry? Why is your face downcast? If you do what is right, will you not be accepted? But if you do not do what is right, sin is crouching at the door. It desires to have you, but you must roll over it, right? So once again, thinking about that idea of being targeted and vulnerable. Sin is at the door. It's waiting. I think that's it. Wanted to, next week what we're going to talk about is the book also offers some suggestions on how to, strategies for trying to stay away from sin, which I think some of these are good. I've liked sharing these. One of the chapters starts out with a story, and we'll end with this. The teens like this story. They found it humorous. But I'll just read. This is about wise strategies. Imagine someone whose weakness is eating donuts. For some of us, that may not be a stretch of an imagination. His doctor says, no more donuts. He vows to God, no more donuts. He calls the church and gets on the prayer chain. He even goes to the donut deliverance ministry to have the demon of donut desire cast out of him. Here's a guy that means business, right? But then what does he do? Well, if he's like a lot of us, he goes right on reading about donuts, listening to donut music, and watching television programs about making donuts. He spends his time with other donut lovers talking about donuts. He jokes about donuts with his buddies. He looks through the newspaper for coupons about donuts, and he goes to the websites that have pictures of donuts. It's not long before he's driving the long way to work that just happens to go by the donut shop. He rolls down the window, and he inhales. It smells good. Pretty soon, he's buying the morning paper from the rack right outside the donut shop. He's lingering just long enough to peer through the window and see the donuts inside. Then he remembers that he needs to use the restroom, and just lo and behold, the donut shop happens to have a restroom. And since he's in there anyways, why not have a cup of coffee? And then what do you think happens? He has a donut, right? I mean, to all of us, when we read the story, probably got halfway through, and you're like, I know how this is going to end. But you hear the front of the story, and here's all these things this guy did. You think he means business, right? But then you see what he does, and he's starting to do the opposite, right? And it's funny when it talks about donuts, right? But then when we insert something else in there, like sin, it suddenly becomes very serious, right? And sometimes I think his point is that we do this to ourselves too. Have you ever maybe thought of a point in your life or seen someone else do it where we kind of trick ourselves that we are taking something seriously when we're kind of not? We're not doing everything we could to stay away from it. Just like this guy. It sounds great, but really, we all know from the story where he's going to end up. So next week, we'll talk a little bit about some strategies. What are things that we can do to make sure that we are doing our best to stay away from sin? And point of this is to sexual immorality. So thank you all. Everybody's invited, certainly. If you're a visitor, please come, enjoy some food as we celebrate Evan and Cade's graduation. So thank you all.